Welcome to the Provost Podcast. My name is Tim Huebner. I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And I'm here today with Professor Sarah Ifft Decker of the Department of History. Professor Ifft Decker earned her bachelor's degree from Swarthmore, her master's from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Yale in 2017. She's a historian of the medieval world and is the author of Jewish Women in the Medieval World and also The Fruit of Her Hands, Jewish and Christian Women's Work in Medieval Catalan Cities, published by Penn State University Press in 2022. The Fruit of Her Hands is also a notable book because it has won an award. It was recognized with the La Coronica International Book Award for the best monograph on medieval Iberian literatures, languages, and culture. It has also earned an honorable mention by the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship for its best first book of feminist scholarship on the Middle Ages prize. Thank you for joining me here today, Professor Ifft Decker. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Well, I'd like us to spend some time just talking about your life and work as a scholar. How and why did you decide to become a medieval historian?
Yeah, so I'd always had an interest in history and then took a family trip to England and decided I'd never really done any European history. I'd just done American history. So I started reading, and I started in the Middle Ages and never really left. And what I really fell in love with when I started reading and then when I went on and actually chose Swarthmore in part because they have a medieval studies program that I could major in, is I really just fell in love with, in particular, being able to uncover women's stories in a period where people often assume that women weren't allowed to do anything, that women weren't able to work, that women weren't able to have any kind of power or control over their own lives, and that I found so many fascinating stories that made it really clear that that was not in fact true. And then was able to find out through research that I began while I was at Swarthmore, thanks to the mentorship, actually, of a professor there. One of the great things about small liberal arts colleges.
Yes, of course.
That I was encouraged to go and actually do research abroad, working with some documents called notarial registers. And these include basically records of contracts that involve basically everyday business done by ordinary people. And I realized that you could actually recover the lives and tell the stories of all of these ordinary women who are not famous, who are not important in the grand scheme of history, but by learning more about their lives, you're able to say so much more about what a kind of ordinary or everyday woman's life actually would have looked like in the relatively distant past.
Very interesting. So that research that you did in those records then shaped your dissertation, which turned into your first book, The Fruit of Her Hands, right?
Yes.
And so tell us more about sort of why you wrote this book specifically and the sort of contribution that it makes to your field.
So one of the things that really intrigued me, especially as I got into this material and started working with these records, was that it really hammered home for me the realization that women have always worked. And this is something that people assume often is something modern, right? The kind of the concept or phenomenon of women regularly working outside the home. But it's very clear that that is not the case. This is something that has always been a possibility for women. And that as I'm looking at these documents, I'm able to see that we're not just talking about the kinds of professions that are low paid and low status, which is often the assumption for women in the Middle Ages, but that women are working in some of the most economically vibrant sectors. There are women who are active in credit, in commercial investment, in fields like silk weaving, that there are all sorts of really interesting things that women are doing. And I was interested in this project and being able to compare Jewish and Christian women, which actually I had initially wanted to do in my very first undergraduate project and was told that's too much for an undergraduate thesis. So I just did Jewish women for that. But for this, that I wanted to look at Jewish and Christian women, and I initially really expected that they would look relatively similar because there's been so much scholarship focusing on the ways that Jews and Christians shared a common culture in some ways in the late medieval Mediterranean. Instead, I found major differences and in particular noticed that Jewish women were in a lot of ways much less active and much less visible in the documentary record than their Christian counterparts. And this has to do with certain legal distinctions and their relationship as well as a subordinated minority and their relationship to the culture of the Christian majority. But it, for me, really emphasized, and this is, I hope, one of the contributions I was able to make with this book, the importance of intersectionality in studying medieval women's history. And this is, of course, a term that has been emphasized a lot in kind of modern and contemporary concerns, but that is also one I think that's really important for historical scholarship. And so one of the things that I really emphasize is, first of all, that there are a lot of options for women's work, but that it looked very different depending on a combination of socioeconomic status, religion, marital status. That understanding this intersectional perspective can really give us a much richer understanding of what women's work looked like.
Well, it certainly sounds like a valuable contribution to the field, and obviously your work has been widely recognized, and understandably so. So thank you for that. Tell us, what other projects are you working on?
So I'm working on a couple of projects right now, and one of them is inspired by some documents that I came across in the course of working on this previous project, that Jews were meant to be self-governing in certain spheres, and in particular in things having to do with the family. So anything related to inheritance or marriage or divorce was something that was supposed to be organized within the Jewish community, but that I started coming across these contracts where Jews are handling some of those affairs in contracts drawn up in Latin by Christian legal professionals. And so this new project is looking at more material in Catalonia, but also moving a bit further afield into southern France and Italy, and looking at some of the reasons that Jews decided to draw up these contracts and what kinds of experiences they had in doing so. So I have that project, and then a project actually inspired in some ways by some of my experiences teaching here at Rhodes, that I've spent a lot of my time teaching and talking about the histories of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And so my other project that I'm working on at the moment is a history of gender and anti-Judaism and the specific way in which those are linked together.
Well, and I specifically want to talk about teaching in just a second, but for some of our listeners who might not understand what it takes to do the type of actual research that you've done on these projects, if you wouldn't mind, just talk a little bit about how you do this work, what it's like to go into the archives. Obviously, you are reading these texts and these documents that probably not a lot of folks have actually looked at. And they're not in English either.
No, they're not.
So why don't you talk a little bit about that whole process, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, so I go through basically these big books of contracts. Very few of them have been digitized, so the vast majority of them, I'm actually going physically to archives in Europe and looking at these documents in person. They're on paper. They're actually the oldest of these from the 13th century are actually some of the oldest European paper documents that still survive, which is really fascinating. And they are written in Latin. They are also written in truly terrible handwriting. The documents that I look at are basically the copies that these notaries, these legal professionals kept for their own records, which means this is where they used all of the abbreviations, where they just kind of really quickly scrawled things and didn't really pay attention to how clearly they were writing. So they're pretty messy, but they're also, I think, extremely rewarding in part because of that, that you can have when you can actually, first of all, decipher what they say and then realize how interesting and exciting they are, and that they really are often things that I'm looking at that no one has talked about before.
Obviously, very painstaking, very careful work that has to be done in those sources. So you mentioned teaching. Tell us a little bit about the types of courses that you teach here at Rhodes College and why.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in making the medieval past something that is accessible and approachable to students. It often seems very distant and strange to people who don't necessarily know something already coming in about medieval history. And also to emphasize the kind of diversity of lived experiences in the medieval world. So I'm really interested in incorporating some of the themes that are common to my research as well. So discussions about gender and the experiences of women, discussions as well about some queer histories in the Middle Ages, thinking about the kind of different experiences of people of different ethnic and religious groups in the medieval past, and trying essentially to kind of present a wide variety of perspectives. So some of the courses that I teach where I try to do that, I currently am doing a course called Law, Power, and Violence in the Middle Ages.
Tell us about that one.
So that is an upper level course that uses legal history as a lens through which to kind of bring a lot of these themes together. So we talk about some of the ways that women are able to access legal systems, but also some of the ways that legal systems are weaponized against them. Right now, we're spending some time talking about the both the ways that different religious communities understand law as connected to their identity, but also are about to go into some of the ways that law is used to regulate religious minorities, including episodes, of course, of religious violence that are legally sanctioned as well. So thinking about a lot of these connections and again bringing a lot of different perspectives. And this is also a course that, because it's a 400-level history course, is a course where students get to do really extensive research on their own. They're expected to come up with a 20 to 25-page research paper.
Okay.
So, and this is something that, I'm spending a lot of time kind of working with them over the course of the semester, and they are doing really exciting things. It's really a pleasure to see Rhodes students kind of get into this material and engage with this material and come up with something that's exciting and original.
So just to follow up on that, sort of given how you have to do your research and sort of given that students can't necessarily fly over to the archives on the other side of the ocean, how do you get them into the sources? What do they have access to?
Yeah, so we are fortunate in that there are a lot of people who have done the really valuable and important work of translating and editing various sources from the Middle Ages. So I spend a lot of time working with them on how to find those sources and on how to pick a topic that is feasible, right? And that feasibility means something different in the context of undergraduate research on medieval history than it would for me, right? Because they're not going to go to Europe and look in archives. They don't necessarily have Latin or Spanish or Hebrew or Arabic or the other languages that might be relevant. But still, there is really enough out there that I have found that often they can really do some fantastic work, including that I've even had a student actually from a previous time that I taught a version of this class who was actually published in the Rhodes Historical Review,
Excellent.
our student-run academic journal.
Yes, that's excellent, outstanding. Well, and picking up on that, so why? And this is a sort of question for those out there who might be thinking about coming to Rhodes College.
Yes.
Why should students come to Rhodes to study history?
So I'm going to say our professors, but I don't mean that to brag about myself. I mean that to brag about my colleagues.
Sure.
So I think that everyone in the Department of History does really exciting work, both in and out of the classroom, that we have scholars who really are doing really interesting research and are also teaching a really wide spectrum of classes. I know that students really like the fact that they get the opportunity to work closely with professors here. That's the great thing, as I've said before, about a small liberal arts college, is that you really get to be kind of guided in research by faculty members who are experts in their field in a way that you don't necessarily get to experience at some larger institutions as an undergraduate. So that's something that I think is really valuable if you're really invested in historical research and in learning from faculty members. And people, I think, also do in the department have a real interest in trying to create courses that are really going to spark students' interest, so that, we are kind of intersecting with film histories in various ways as faculty members. We're kind of, responding to kind of growing kind of interests in kind of gender and how that relates maybe to contemporary issues. So I think, we have a very responsive faculty and a very vibrant faculty in the department.
That's great. Thank you. Last question. What makes Rhodes College special to you?
So first and foremost, it is my students. They are so impressive to me in terms of their ability, first of all, to model a spirited but respectful debate.
Yes.
I teach a Women in the Bible course, which often brings up a lot of challenging topics, and I'm always excited to see how students in that class are able to disagree with one another, but disagree with one another in ways that are very thoughtful. And in that class and other classes as well, I'm also so impressed by how they're open to new ideas, that you can really see first-year students coming in and learning things that challenge their expectations, and that they're excited about the opportunity to do that and to expand their knowledge and to have their kind of worldviews and ideas challenged to some extent, and be able to think through them and develop a better idea about their own kind of values and sense of the world. And they also then, especially as they move forward, they do such brilliant and exciting work. In addition to, I've talked a little bit about students who have been published in the Rhodes Historical Review. I also had the real pleasure of being able to work with a student who was doing an honors thesis, really exciting work on childbirth rituals in late medieval England. And she was actually even able to go to some rare book libraries and do some independent research on her own with
That's
that.
great.
Yeah, and so really the kinds of things that we're able to see our students do is so wonderful. And of course, I also do want to give a shout out to the city of Memphis, which I had spent almost no time in before moving here for this position at Rhodes, but have really come to love it as a city. It's a really vibrant culture. It has a great food scene. Overall, it just for me is a really great place to live.
That's great. That's great. Well, it has been a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you today. Professor Sarah Ifft Decker of the Department of History at Rhodes College. Her book that we mentioned earlier is The Fruit of Her Hands, Jewish and Christian Women's Work in Medieval Catalan Cities. It's a prize-winning book published in 2022. It's available at the Rhodes College bookstore. It has been my pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you here today. And this is Tim Huebner, the Provost at Rhodes College. Thanks for joining me today for the Provost Podcast.